Thanks. Thanks a lot for this invitation, which is an honor, naturally. So we're going to, what I'll try to do is a presentation around the relevance of the classical theories of imperialism, or to be more accurate, the classical debates on imperialism for contemporary discussion of the international system. Let's say that the point of departure for this thinking is the return of imperialism in the 21st century, the return it both in the theoretical vocabulary, but also in the political vocabulary. Whereas the 1990s were the golden age of globalization. Everyone was talking about globalization. In the 2000s, and still in the 2010s, imperialism, empire, imperialist rivalry, these kind of notions have returned, both in Marxist debates, and we had a whole series of very important Marxist interventions in the last 10 years, especially in the 2000s, like books by David Harvey, by Ellen Maxine-Woods, by Alex Kalinikos, but also it was interesting the return of empire, of imperialism also in mainstream theoreticians, in people writing about the policies of the United States, etc., etc. So, the question, however, what are the theoretical questions that we must face when we discuss imperialism? One is, what is a theory of imperialism? For example, is it just a theory that combines Marxist political economy with, let's say, realist geopolitics? That is, geopolitics of balance of forces, etc., like that. Is a theory of imperialism that we just add geopolitics to our classical, let's say, Marxist economics? We add an economic flavor to the traditional international relations discourse about states antagonizing themselves in the international plane. Is it just that? Is imperialism a territorial theory? That means, in the end, imperialist rivalry and antagonism have to do with territory, grabbing more land, for example? Is it a theory of a unified global system, or of a theory of a unified empire? This can, and of course, we can also think of other questions. But these are the main questions. What is a theory of imperialism? We all have the tendency, and I come from a country where the vocabulary of imperialism and anti-imperialism is very common. You can hear all people using it. You can hear, right-wing or central politicians using it. Being a country who has taken part in everything that has happened in the Balkans, in 2 World Wars, it has gone through a civil war, it has had very, very traditional forms of imperialist intervention from the British or the United States afterwards. So, but the theoretical question is, what is imperialism as a theory? What it means, a Marxist theory of imperialism? Now, I said one suggestion, and it's been rather well argued, is the one that has been suggested mainly by Alex Kalinikos. Alex Kalinikos has said that we must incorporate the state system into the international level, see the antagonisms at that level as a dimension of the capitalist mode of production, but he insists that this combines two forms, or I can say two logics of competition. One among capitals, that is, capitals antagonizing themselves in global markets for greater market shares, etc., etc. And at the same time, a geopolitical competition between states. The problem is that, now, some years before Kalinikos, a very important Marxist theory, who unfortunately passed away in 2009, and one of the best analysts of American post-World War II imperialist policies, Peter Gowan, had also suggested a similar synthesis in his books regarding American foreign policy, where he has tried to explain how American foreign policy was also a very aggressive attempt to promote American capitalist interests. However, there is a problem with simply adding geopolitics to capitalist political economy. The problem is, what defines geopolitics? What is the nature of interstate antagonism? Now, as people who have studied international relations know, realism is one of the most well-known traditions in international theory, and it is also the dominant theory. In fact, the very subject, the very discipline of international relations was formed after World War II, based on what they called realist principles, that is, the geopolitics of Cold War. Antagonism between states, its philosophy, its basic comes from Hobbes. It's a Hobbesian philosophy. That is, the international system is something like Hobbes, war of everyone against anyone. So states in this conception are autonomous actors trying to maximize their interest and always in antagonism with each other. And traditionally, realism was opposed to traditional idealist conceptions of cosmopolitan democracy, etc., etc. Of course, now, if you have to, at gunpoint, have to choose between, an idealist conception of cosmopolitan democracy and something like that, and, realism in geopolitics, realism is like fresh air. It's more closer to reality. There are interstate antagonisms in the world. Globalization did not evolve into a global polity. We do not have a global civil society, and we still have too many points of tension and war, etc., etc. And the US acted as a hegemon in the 2000s, trying to enforce its policies. But this is not Marxism. This is not that particular way that Marxism revolutionizes thinking of the political. It does not explain what is the connection between the economics and the politics. Of course, we can think in terms of interests. States defend interests. This is correct, this is true. But we all know that in the same way, but if we say, for example, capitalist state represents capitalist class interests, we now, and after all these years of Marxist theoretical debates of the states, that this is simplistic. Where is hegemony? Where is ideology? Where is alliances? Where is the complexities of politics that we see, for example, in a state? So, if we want this kind of complexity when we deal within a state, why go back to some, rather simplistic conception of international system states defending capitalist interests, and this creates geopolitical tension? It is true, but it's also truism. That means something that can be true on all cases. So we need to go a little bit deeper. I'm not saying I have an answer, but I'm just saying that simply adding a geopolitical dimension to classical Marxist political economy is not enough. Although I have to say that both Alex Kalinikos and Peter Gowan, the things they say about American imperialism are pretty much correct, in terms of political analysis. Now, on the other hand, what was interesting in the 2000s, and this will help us go back to classical debates, was the return of the territorial logic. That is, imperialism as land grabbing. The best example and the most vocal proposition in this direction was David Harvey's theory of accumulation by dispossession in his book about imperialism from 2003. Now, David Harvey is a brilliant geographer, and he's also has this very, very positive, and a good Marxist, and he has this very, very positive attitude of introducing concepts, trying to think the changes in the world and introduce things. Now, what he did in the 2000s was he tried to combine something that he knew from, as a geographer, that is, the importance of spatio-temporal fixes, that capital is not just an ethereal relation, it materializes itself in practices that take place in space and time. It has to be anchored, it has to be rooted in space. You have to build a factory. You have to build a commercial center. You have to build an industrial center. You have to build an economic hub. You have to build an international economic center, etc., etc. Whatever think of, let's say, the internet or this kind of communication, things have to be in a certain place at a certain time. And at the same time, he is very, very well aware of the importance of investment in land. And now, what he tried to say was that neoliberalism is not just labor deregulation and privatization and attack on labor unions and austerity. It is also a predatory, a very aggressive quest for assets all over the world to grab things. Either in the which he saw it both in financialization and in privatization. So he, and the example he, and yes, so, and he can count within this tendency both processes such as investments in land, property bubbles, but also aggressive privatizations, especially in other countries, aggressive privatization of natural resources. We've had wars over, practically wars over water. The privatization of water in many countries has been a very important point of contestation. But the interesting thing, now this phenomena should take place, but what troubles me is how he relates it to Rosa Luxemburg's theory of imperialism and to Marx's theory of primitive accumulation. I have a very long passage. I have some very long passages. But I have them in the PowerPoint so that I cannot read them, which makes things more interesting. And since I try to make my my presentation a little bit more pleasant than a visit to the dentist. So this is interesting because we can think private accumulation. Okay, this is a process of the enclosures, and we know very well from Marx, from the relevant chapter in Capital, that unless Capital managed to impose in a violent way a new right of property over territories and spaces that were not meant to be the property of anyone, we would not have had capitalism, because this was the beginning of the British agrarian capitalism, and both Robert Brenner and Ellen Maxins would have written extraordinary things about these histories. At the same time, he reminds us of Rosa Luxemburg, and I will try to, and I will discuss Rosa Luxemburg just after David Harvey, because I think this is important. What he tries to say is, that primitive accumulation is something that is constantly being repeated. And he links this to Rosa Luxemburg's position that capitalism must always find an outside where he could invest and expand and overcome its inherent tendency towards crisis. So he does not think that it is primitive. He does not think that it is original. He thinks that this is constant. And he calls this, David Harvey, accumulation by dispossession. He uses dispossession exactly because he insists, and these are the examples he uses, that there is always a violent change in who controls or who owns a property. Whether it's from public, it becomes private, from common, it becomes the property of someone, etc. Now, it's interesting that Harvey has a theory of crisis, and his theory of crisis, although not very elaborate, it is a theory of constant tendency, of chronic problems of overaccumulation. He thinks that the financial system practically answered overaccumulation by financialization, that is, transferring funds that could not be productively invested towards the financial sphere, and then through the financial sphere in an attempt to find new places of investment, usually by processes of dispossession, including the opening up of new territories of accumulation. And he links neoliberal theory to this. That neoliberal theory was also about that. It was not just a version of liberalism. And he thinks that, and here is where, in my opinion, the territorial logic comes, he links this to contemporary imperialism. And what he had in mind, when he wrote these lectures, was the war in Iraq and the global war in terror. So for him it was an attempt to devaluate, because that's how you can actually dispossess, buy them cheap. If you want to buy them cheap, you have to devaluate. How you can accept imperialism is also such a process in Harvey's view. So. And he thinks that contemporary imperialism is basically about that. For example, oil, which is his main example, is something like that. It is a capitalism in overaccumulation who needs to find an outlet to be invested, find a place to be invested, a terrain, an economic practice. He cannot find it at home. He cannot find it in terms of revolutions in productivity and competitiveness. So he tries to predatory grab or buy as cheap as possible assets, land, natural resources, etc., all over the world. And if this means waging wars or finding pretexts for wars, then he will go and wage wars. This is David Harvey's example. But the question is that this brings us very close to the territorial logic. And what I hope I will try in the end to present is that exactly this is the problem. Capitalist imperialism in its fullest form is not about territory. Territory is the main characteristic of pre-capitalist imperialism. Why? For the very simple reason that the main productive power was land. The main means to increase wealth production was to have more land. So there was an inherently territorial logic in pre-capitalist empires, whether it is the Roman Empire or other empires. Of course, they also were tributary empires. They would receive tribute and taxes and things like that, but they were territorial in nature. The main aspect of capitalist imperialism, that is the internationalization of capital, the exports of capital, the productive investment of capital, the creation of means to accumulate outside one's borders and, in this sense, expand without actually, going and occupying a territory. Because I think this is the main the main characteristic of capitalist imperialism. So I think that's interesting how David Harvey, for whom I have the greatest respect, arrived at a very classical territorial logic. But it's also interesting how he arrived at a very classical conception of imperialism as an answer to a chronic crisis, which brings us to the most eloquent, the best expression, manifestation of this tendency, which was, of course, Rosa Luxemburg. So let's go back to classical theories. Let's start with Luxemburg. Now, this is one of Rosa Luxemburg's most well-known passages. It is from The Accumulation of Capital. The Accumulation of Capital is an impressive book. It still is one of the most impressive books of Marxist scholarship. Very, very impressive. I have left out, of course, the theoretical background, which is how to deal with the problem of extended reproduction. As it is well known, Marx, in the second volume of Capital, suggested that if we take productive investment into consideration, that is, accumulation with a view to invest and expand, then we can have a balance. We do not have a chronic imbalance, so the system can be reproduced. We can have expanded reproduction of capital. And he has a numerical example. As usual, when Marx tried to use numbers, he usually made mistakes. This created some debates. Tugendbaranowski sort of offered the right numbers, but then Luxemburg insisted that it's not possible. Of course, it is not just about numbers. It is about whether you choose what kind of dynamic do you put in the system. It's a question of temporality. As such, it's really interesting, because the temporality of the balance of extended reproduction that Marx suggests, it's a dynamic one, and it's, of course, not certain. It is contingent upon, it can also, a crisis can interrupt it. So, what Luxemburg tried to do was trying to say that crises were inevitable. So there was no position for this to happen. So what was the answer? Imperialism. But imperialism created that extra variable who could be inserted in the equation and, of course, make possible this kind of reproduction. Now, of course, the problem is, I will go to this quote, that unfortunately, and despite the many, many, many merits of Luxemburg's book, it is a teleological book. It is a book that insists in the inevitability of collapse. Because, and he thinks that it is, in the end, it will be impossible to overcome the contradiction about what capitalism produces and what the workers consume, which is also, as we all know, the main point of all under-consumptionist theories. And we all know that most people on the left, including, I suppose, all of us tend to always think that capitalism will collapse under the fact that exploitation limits the ability to consume. But of course, this is always when we think at the level of surfaces, and we do not think in terms of dynamics and the possibility of extended reproduction. And of course, history proved that capitalism did not actually collapse. It changed and went through severe crisis. It is through a severe crisis now, but it did not collapse in that. And of course, the problem with Luxemburg's position was that it is as if capitalism will collapse the moment it will prevail. That is, if we have capitalism all over the globe, if all forms of production are capitalist, then there's no outside to counter for the chronic imbalance between production and consumption, which will, of course, lead to stagnation and crisis and disaster. Now, so here is how she describes. There is capital accumulated, it does not find an outlet, it must, for this surplus product, it must go to the international stage, etc., find other countries, bring them, etc., etc. But of course, it's a period of catastrophe. So it's, in the end, it's just... Now, this is not, as we know, something that only Luxembourg thought. In fact, some of the proponents of imperialism actually thought in that way. The debates regarding imperialism in the late 1890s and early 1900s were exactly on this question, that imperialism is good, it offers some productive outlet, we will suffer crisis, it will bring social peace, etc., etc. All the positive arguments in favor. Some of them were also expressed by certain socialists. For example, it is a well-known fact that the Fabian socialists in Britain were pro-empire, were pro-imperialist, and John Bernard Shaw, when he wrote the Fabian program, he openly speaks in favor of the civilizing, etc., role of imperialism. And if we try to think of the world at that period, right before World War I, it made sense, this image of countries antagonizing themselves, rushing to grab whatever has been left of Africa, creating all kinds of colonies, getting ready to tear apart whatever was left of the Ottoman Empire, and of course getting ready for World War with an immense, giant military preparation effort, which of course, as we all know, started in 1914. That's exactly, and for Luxembourg, of course, this was linked to imperialism. Imperialism led to war. Of course, this was also a common position of all socialists of that time, that imperialism would lead to war. But what is interesting in Luxembourg, and it's interesting that we see this thing repeated in the history of the left. Repeated both as theory, but also as, let's say, common sense. What is imperialism? Capitalism is in crisis. Why is it in crisis? Because exploitation means reduced consumption, and in this way undermines the position of capital. What do capitalists do? Find new markets, or find cheaper products, or exploit other, and so let's go and grab other lands. So what is imperialism about? In fact, occupying other countries and exploiting them. You can see them. You can see them in left-wing tracts even today, when they discuss war or empire or things like that. So, so you have the three elements: territorial logic, a catastrophic logic of a catastrophic teleology of capitalism, and imperialism as an answer to this catastrophic tendency. This was what we saw. Now, this is interesting. This is in 1915. Rosa Luxemburg wrote her famous Anti-Critique, where she answered the many criticisms she had received upon the publication of accumulation of capital. And there was this. It's interesting that Bukharin also wrote an answer to this Anti-Critique, and at least, as far, I think, both in German and in English, I have the English translation, these two texts come together, Luxemburg's Anti-Critique and Bukharin's answer to it. And I think that, by the way, this is the best text by Bukharin on imperialism, not the classical 1917 one. But I will come up to that later. It's interesting, the answers, the critiques against that she discusses are things like the ones we said, regarding both the question of excessive reproduction and about imperialism. And it's interesting, here she makes even more clear her position. Accumulation is impossible in an exclusively capitalist environment. It now becomes like a certain theoretical obsession that you cannot have accumulation if you do not have a non-capitalist periphery, which is either outside of a social formation or within a social formation. Now, this is interesting because it is like, she's not saying it, I will use the phrase, something like primitive accumulation has always to repeat itself. Now, I would say, just to think, I'm not actually believe that it is so simple, that you can see the main contradiction in certain aspects of the new enclosures position associated with many radical currents recently, for example, post-workerist threads. I'm not saying that there is not a repeated tendency towards this kind of enclosure, but this is part of accumulation, and it's constantly repeated, not in the sense that capitalism cannot reproduce by itself and needs a non-capitalist outside, a non-capitalist other. I think that even if we accept this metaphor of a primitive accumulation that repeats itself constantly, I would prefer, as an image, not the outside, but the depth. Capitalism deepens its relations, finds new, it makes even more capitalist, even those areas that were already colonized, to use Habermas' metaphor, by capitalism. So, in this sense, yes, you can see the attempt, the constant attempt, which is a defining feature of capitalism, the constant attempt towards finding new terrains of exploitation, subsuming them under the capital relation, but not in the sense of stagnation and search for outside. It's more like the constant tendency of capitalism to revolutionize itself and, in this sense, survive. So, but I think that's very, 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 very interesting. And again, this catastrophism against this kind of teleological conception of capitalism tendencies towards crisis. Now, let's see Bukhari at his critique. Now, on the one hand, which again has to do with numbers and things like that, which I don't find very interesting, he deconstructs the question of any limit to reproduction, adding, but it's interesting that he adds the dynamic of class struggle. That's interesting. He does not try to find simply a numerical condition or simply add a temporal dimension, in the sense that reproduction is never reproduction at a frozen moment. Extended reproduction always tilts towards the future, always has this open question. But he also introduces the element of class struggle, that it is a question of class balance of forces, whether this will lead to a crisis or not. And it's interesting that he uses crisis, not a general tendency. Because capitalism does have crises, and crises are an example, above all, of the fact that capitalism is a class mode of production. It's a mode of production that has class struggle at the heart of its constitution. So nothing is purely technical, nothing is purely economical. In the end, in the last analysis, everything has to do with class struggle. So yes, there can be overproduction. Yes, there can be crisis. But not that overproduction must manifest itself at all times, etc., etc. And it's also interesting that he makes a very, very important conceptual switch, conceptual shift regarding what is the motive for expansion. And Luxemburg's schema is based upon thinking about capitalist expansion as a way to realize value. Value is produced, it cannot be consumed, therefore it cannot be realized, it cannot be valorized in the end, so it has to be go someplace else, either as investment or as funds to buy things, or buy assets or natural resources in order to be realized, or find a market, even if it is a non-capitalist market. So he says, no, capitalism, internationalization of capital is not about realization, it is about profit. And it's the search for higher profit rates. It's the search for profitable investments. Of course, and of course, Bukhari here is based as Lenin on Hilferding's insistence on the importance of exports of capital, and of course on the experience of exports of capital at that time. And it's interesting that he uses an example. He says the French, they did not occupy, they asked to occupy Ruhr after World War I, the most advanced industrial center. Why? Because this would have been much more profitable for them. They did not try to grab some non-capitalist periphery. They tried to grab the industrial center of Germany. Why? Because that's, and of course it is now we know that even today the vast majority of foreign direct investment is exchanged between advanced capitalist countries and does not go towards the periphery, even the capitalist periphery. And I think that in this sense Bukhari was right and he was justified. So I think this is more important than perhaps people thought at that time. Because Bukhari in this text is much more closer to theories of imperialism after World War II than the classical debates. So, and of course he reminds us that capitalism is not about realization, capitalism is about the profit rate. That's the most important variable, and that's the variable also that is in a certain way, in a certain dialectic, more determined by class struggle in the last instance, because that's where all determinations are fused. Now, and so he is also insisting on the specificity of imperialism and also on the specificity of, I would say, capitalist imperialism, or I would say, although now, of the capitalism of that period. Some years ago we might call it monopoly capitalism, but this kind of expressions have fallen from grace. But I mean the kind of advanced capitalism based upon relative surplus value, extended reproduction, a real subsumption of labor, etc., etc. That's what Bukhari is saying. As capitalism evolves, so imperialism evolves. And of course this is something we can also see in history, because we know very well that in a certain way the emergence of capitalism encountered existing modes of imperialism. And if we try to do an actual history of imperialism, for example, from the 15th century onwards, it will be a rather complex and very uneven history. I mean, for example, it would be uncertain to say, for example, that the Spanish crown set out and discover the Americas in a capitalist logic. I know that Immanuel Wallerstein suggests this in his world systems theory, but I would be skeptical. As we very well know, but that when the British took up, they brought a capitalist logic. For example, by enforcing a very savage variety of agrarian capitalism in the colonies using slave labor, which was, of course, a capitalist slave labor, a capitalist phenomenon. So you have an encounter. Social forms do not, emerge as Minerva from the head of Zeus. They are made like a bricolage from different elements, historicals, and the cleverness of capitalism, if I may use this word, was that it could take and incorporate elements from previous modes of production or previous social forms. He took state centralization, for example. State centralization was not from the beginning capitalist. In France, it had a different history, but he integrated it. He took imperialism and transformed it. He took the culture of the cities and transformed it to bourgeois culture, etc., etc. So I think this is important what Bukharin says here about we must think what are the specific characteristics of capitalist imperialism in the period of the extended production of capital and of finance capital, etc., etc., which means it's not a territorial capitalism. It's about profit, it's about export of capitals. Now let's go to Lenin. Now, Lenin's theory of imperialism. There are some wrong readings of Lenin. Usually, and you can see it in many, many books. You can say, oh, okay, Lenin, when he wrote about imperialism, he didn't write very much. He was like a classical theorist of colonial empire building, tried to radicalize theories such as the one suggested by Hobson, for whom, as we all know, it is well-documented fact, Lenin had the greatest admiration. That we know that Lenin has been very much accused that he also had the same problem with a theory of irremediable capitalist stagnation and reproduction, and that he practically also thought of imperialism as a way to deal with stagnation and the creation of a labor aristocracy. But I think this is our own reading. But before explaining why I think it's our own reading, let's say some of the problems with Lenin, especially with the pamphlet on imperialism. I think that Lenin takes up books on world capitalism a little bit too literally in the leaflet on imperialism. Now, Bukharin does not say that there is a global capitalism. That would be unfair. But he tends to see, but the problem with Bukharin, and Lenin did follow him on that, was that he takes this image of the intensive cartelization of enterprises and the creation of very big conglomerates into a thinking that in each state you have, let's say, a national trust, national capitalist trusts, and not just companies. And the states represent these national trusts, and you have an antagonism of this sort in the international sphere. Of course, cartelization was indeed a very, very important tendency at that time, as was, of course, the impressive tendencies towards both concentration and centralization of capital. These were well-documented tendencies, and both Hilferding and Bukharin were right to stress them. But the problem is, was it only that? Was it an end of antagonism and competition on all levels? Or the tendency towards concentration and centralization went hand in hand with competition. And at the same time, what do states represent in the international plane? Are they simple representatives of national trusts and national companies? In a certain manner, yes. It was not. It was true. It was right. States do, and they still do. But we must remember that states represent the collective capitalist interest, and collective capitalist interest is not just the aggregate of individual capitalist interests. It's not just the median of whatever. It is a more strategic conception. It has to do with it, and this is of course the very point of the relative autonomy of the capitalist state vis-à-vis even capitalists themselves. Try to can excuse this Pelagian and Althusserien reference to relative autonomy. So this is something that is indeed lacking in this conception of states as representatives of national trusts, etc., and underestimate. Now, and of course, yes, Lenin, we should never forget that imperialism was a kind of a propaganda leaflet, not a very thorough theoretical, and you can also see this kind of hyperbole as here. Monopolies, no more competition, etc., etc. So this is another problem. And of course, yes, as I also said, a rather instrumentalist conception of the state as a tool in the hands of monopoly capital and big trusts, which of course is in contradictions to other writings by Lenin on the state, such as State and Capital, which represent a much more and more complex. And of course, the whole problem with this imagery of a moribund capitalism, a capitalist in his final death stage, etc., 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 which of course too good to be true. It did not happen. That's the problem with all these theories. This is some form of wishful thinking. Now, I think that we can also try another reading of Lenin. Perhaps not only of Lenin, perhaps can also add Bukharin here and some of the other thinkers of that period, but I will stick to Lenin. I think that the main thing that they accomplished, despite the shortcomings of the way they presented it, was that they gave a new meaning to imperialism. They actually introduced the concept of imperialism in its Marxist sense. Even in Rosa Luxemburg, imperialism is still being thought of as a practice, not as a constitutive feature of capitalism. It is a practice. Capitalism is in crisis, it has to aggressively expand to the non-capitalist periphery. And of course, non-Marxist social democratic theories of imperialism, such as Hobson, thought of the description of imperialism is what was happening. No theoretical conception. I think that culminating with Lenin, but also you can find elements in Hilferding and Bukharin, is a different meaning of imperialism. It's an attempt to think the international system as a complex unity of economic, social and political contradictions, as a hierarchy of social formations, engaged in a complex dialectics of economic competition, but also political and military antagonism. Of course, this is at the same time an answer and a whole lot of open questions. But I think this is what is the revolutionary aspect of those debates. To use a metaphor by Althusser, they opened an important theoretical subcontinent, the subcontinent of imperialism, another way to view the international system as opposed to any other kind of reading until that time. And I think, just a minute, and what is also important in this sense, I'm not good with PowerPoints, I'll come back to it. Which is the important aspect? With what, for example, marks the difference between Marxist theories of imperialism, even in all their problems and contradictions, what is different from, let's say, the best realist international relations theorist? The difference is that in the Marxist conception of imperialism, class relations take analytical priority over interstate relations. States in the international system, do not react or behave simply on the basis of their interests. What's an interest? They are determined by their social structure, by the strategies that are articulated within. But what is dominant and what is not dominant by a class balance of forces. So in this sense, imperialism is not a drive towards accumulation or land grabbing or asset grabbing or enclosures. It is an expansion of a whole set of social relations and social forms. Now, this is, and I think this is what is interesting in Lenin's characterization of imperialism as a stage. Now, we all know that stage theory is not the best thing, and it can lead to a very teleological conception of the evolution of capitalism. But I suggest that we see this conception of imperialism as a stage in another sense. That, in a way, the full extended reproduction of capitalism always has repercussions, has results, transforms the international plane. And this is when imperialism comes into play. And it's also interesting that Lenin insisted, and we will see some passages, on the internationalization of capital as an aggressive tendency, not towards overcoming stagnation, but towards consolidating power, consolidating the extended reproduction of capitalism, and helping in this way bourgeois hegemony. So it's an aggressive class strategy, not a defensive strategy against an inherent tendency towards crisis. And I think that these are very, very, very important aspects when we try to reconceptualize the international and try to think beyond the dichotomy internal social relations and then interstate antagonism. We must find a way to, if I may say the word, short-circuit those two ways of thinking. And I think here is the importance of uneven development. We know that even with a certain arrogance, Lenin says that uneven economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. And I think this is a very important point. Now, this is not a description about how power is unequally distributed. I think this is a more important aspect in this statement. It is that class struggles in a certain complex and overdetermined way create this condition of unevenness. The world is uneven, there is uneven development, there is uneven development of the contradictions because there is class struggle, and there are different specific histories of struggle. Nothing happens in the same way all over the world, but this is not just about success or ability, it's about the class struggle. This is what determines this kind of uneven dynamics. And you can see this, for example, in some of the texts he wrote at that period. We can see it in left-wing communism and infantile, etc., and also on his introductory speech at the Second Congress of the Third International. So, It's interesting how he more and more became conscious of this kind of complexity and uneven development all over the world. And this finds many, you can see in many of his texts of that period. That's what I think I already said. Yes, I will say yes. How unevenness as a result of the contradictions of different balance of forces, etc., etc. Let's go forward. We saw that. I would say now. Before I go to recapitulate on now, I also think that another very, very important position is that of the imperialist chain. Now, I think that it is exactly here that we have Lenin describing the hierarchical, uneven and contradictory character of the international system, also along with the notion of the weakest link of the chain, this whole metaphor and imagery. That means that how our hierarchy is defined in the world, it's not just about power in an absolute sense, or about economic magnitude, etc., etc. It's about what specific balance of class forces exists, what history of class struggle has evolved in its particular social formation, what kind of bourgeois hegemony is in place, what kind of historical bloc is in place, and because there are different and plural histories, that is why you have uneven development, and that is why, and this unevenness is like a knife that cuts at both edges. Of course, on the one hand, it creates hierarchy, it creates dominant capitalist forces, it creates leaders in the imperialist chain. But on the other hand, the unevenness in the imperialist chain creates the possibility of revolution. And here is the importance of the conception of the weak link of the chain. Because it's here that it offers a theory of the revolutionary conjuncture and of the revolutionary moment, and not just of the event, as Alain Badiou might have said, if I may insert some criticism of Badiou here. Now, this is Louis Althusser from Contradiction and Overdetermination, praising Lenin's theory of the weak link, the weakest link. Now, I will read this because I like it. It says, Lenin gave this metaphor above all a practical meaning. A chain is as strong as its weakest link. In general, anyone who wants to control a given situation will look out for a weak point in case it will render the whole system vulnerable. On the other hand, anyone who wants to attack it, even if the odds are apparently against him, need only discover this one weakness to make it all its power precarious. But it's not just about finding the weak spot. What is the notion of the weakness? Weakness means whether you can find all the contradiction, whether you can find that kind of condensation of contradictions that can create a revolutionary situation, that can create the possibility of rupture. And this again is a very big chunk from Althusser's Contradiction and Overdetermination. I will not read this, but I still think it's a fantastic description. Of course, it can only be compared to Lenin's own pages in left-wing communism on the same thing. Why did the revolution happen in Russia? But it's also interesting here that in this whole imagery of the weak link of the chain and the imperialist chain and uneven development, we can see exactly this kind of revolutionizing effect of Lenin theories of imperialism. It's not just a theory of imperialist expansion, it's not just an explanation based upon the internationalization of capital, it's not just a way to think hierarchy in the global system, it's not just a way to think antagonism in the global system, it is in the last instance an attempt to think revolution and the possibility of revolution and the possibility of class struggle as the determining factor of all these developments to reach that breaking point. And it's exactly, I think, this that you can see how this is still is a very fresh way to think of the international system and try to think of all the contradictions, both political and economical, geopolitical and social, in a certain dialectical way. Of course, it is more like open questions, I understand that, but it still seems to me fresh and fascinating. Now, okay, that's something I already said, so I don't have to repeat. Exports of, well, okay, that's interesting. I think that, yes, Lenin insisted, he had took that both from Bukharin and from Hilferding on the centrality of exports of capital. Now, I think that if you think of this capital exports and the role of the state as a representative of the collective capitalist interest, that is the strategic capitalist interest, then you can reach a possible theory of how the internationalization of capital is indeed mediated by state intervention. In the same way that state intervenes within a social formation, it also intervenes outside, and this is the basis of interstate rivalry. But it's not about state interests. It's not just about states defending well-defined interests, about conflicting strategies, representing strategies, and clashing with other class strategies. And of course, this can also explain why in certain conjunctures you can also have interstate, not only interstate rivalry, but also interstate cooperation, if this can accommodate the relevant class strategies. We can see this, for example, see this dialectic of antagonism and cooperation in the European Union. I'll give an example on that later. So I think that this is a very important aspect. And, of course, it is over that with this we go beyond the territorial logic. There is no territorial logic here. Not, at least, I mean, it's not a spaceless process, but it's not territorial in the traditional pre-capitalist empire-building kind of territorial logic. I mean, even if we discuss, well, of course we know the answers, we know the opposition to this, but people say, yes, but there are American bases everywhere. Well, American bases are not the same way as pre-capitalist military installations. They're not like the Roman Empire, exactly, and they don't put consuls in positions that actually govern places, etc., etc. And in certain cases, American bases were not put there actually to safeguard American interests, but to safeguard the interests of national bourgeoisies in those countries. American presence, for example, in South Korea is not only about the age-old antagonism with China over the division of Korea or North Korea as a threat. It is also because South Korean capitalism opposes any process of unification and wants this American presence as a political asset, in the same way that when the Americans came and determined the outcome of the Greek Civil War after 1946, they did not come in order to conquer Greece. In fact, in the 1950s, one of the complaints of the Greek bourgeoisie was that the Americans did not bring money with them, did not bring investment, they did not actually came. So, but the Americans actually came and made sure that Greek bourgeoisie remained in power. And this was good for the imperialist chain, of course. In this sense, in this strategic sense, it was good also for the American interest, but they did not come to Greece and helped the fascists to win the communists in order to, for example, sell more Kelvinator fridges the other day, or things like that. So that's what I'm saying. There is not territorial logic. Of course, there is a space of imperialism. Wars, ships, fleets armies, interventions, bombardments are very, very, very material and very, very place-related things. But they're not the old kind of territorial logic. It is also interesting that it is a political theory, not political in the sense of a division between political and economics, which would have brought us back to classical geopolitics, but of political power as a condensation of class interests. So that. Now, I will make a small Pulagian detour here. When I say political theory, I mean political in the way I think Marx's theory revolutionized how we think of the political. Because if you try to look both in books on geopolitics or in books about politics, mainstream books, if you try to find a definition of the political, you will not find a definition of the political. It's taken as granted, it's taken as something very, 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 very commonsensical. Political power is the ability to have political power, or political power is just the ability to impose a will. Okay. This can also account to most forms of violent crime. Is this political? No, it's not political. But I think that following Pulagius, and this is from Social Class and Political Power, his first major book, power is a capacity of a social class to realize its specific objective interests. And it's also interesting that we can combine this with Pulagius' later relational conception of power and relational conception of the state. Now, I think that this is a very interesting definition because it relates social class, politics, and class interests. It's also interesting that Pulagius, when he refers to objective interests, he does not refer to everyday perceived interests. He refers to what we might call the horizon of class practices. That is, when we define a social class, what is the horizon of its practices? This is its strategic interest. And I think that this is a way that at the same time maintains the analytical priority of exploitation without underestimating the, let's say, the relative autonomy of the political. And in this sense, I might say that such a conception, we can accept both Marx's insistence from the very, very well-known passage from Volume 3 of Capital, how the way unpaid surplus labor is pumped out is the innermost secret of every social structure. Here is it in its full. And of course, Althusser's warning that the lonely hour of the last instance never comes here is in its favor. So, why I'm making this detour into political power? Because I think this is the interesting thing when we say that Lenin offers a political theory of imperialism. It offers a political theory in this sense, in a dialectical way that maintains the priority of exploitation, the priority of class strategy, the priority of class antagonism, and at the same time prevents us from crude economism, prevents us from thinking that war happens for the price of oil, or war happens for grabbing, corn-producing fields or factories or things like that. War does not happen over the price of oil. The price of oil might be a determinant in political strategies. War happens about the hegemony in the imperialist chain. Take, for example, World War I and World War II in Europe as simple historical examples. Can you easily define what were the specific economic interests? Yes, there were colonial antagonisms, and in Africa, for example, and antagonism regarding the Ottoman Empire and their internal problems. But in fact, it was a war of who's going to be the leading force. They didn't start out for that. And the same was, for example, in World War II. It was not simply about economics. It wasn't simply about Germany finding its Lebensraum. Even if we say that it started that way, and the British and the French answered with World War II, in the end it was about who will be the hegemon. So war is never about the price of oil, but of course it is about bourgeois hegemony. It is about the ability to export capital. In the end, yes, you can go back, do some sort of reverse engineering, if I use this metaphor, and find economic interest, but we must put crude economism between, leave it aside. But this does not mean that war is just about politics. War is just, I don't know, the expression of violence or the insanity of the world. No, it is the complex, overdeterminate, and mediated expression of contrasting class strategies regarding the complex and terrain of the imperialist chain. So, but it's also, that's my final point. I think I've lost track of time, which is a bad thing to do, but I suppose that someone will yell something or throw something at me when I am beginning to tire people. Now, I think that another point that can be added here has to do with hegemony. Now, there are lots of interesting writings in the past years in international relations theory that tend to call themselves Gramsci. Robert Cox or Adam was the first and best known, but also recently Adam Morton and others. I think that these are interesting points, although with some of their practical results I disagree. For example, I disagree with Stephen Chill's or William Robinson's conception of a transnational state. I will deal with that later. But I think that hegemony is still has yet to be really introduced into the thinking of imperialism, because I think that it is exactly a very relational theory, which is not only about combining coercion and consent. It is exactly the complex modality of social and political power and how someone becomes a leading force in a society. And why I think hegemony is important. I think that hegemony is important because it can explain better hierarchies in the imperialist chain. And I would like to suggest this regarding, American hegemony. We all know whenever there's an economic crisis, there's always a debate. Is there a decline of American hegemony? Is this the end of the American predominance? We all know that since 1945, no one has really challenged the predominance of the US in the imperialist chain, both its economic and political and military force, and in the 2000s, it attempted in a very, very arrogant way, and it paid the price, it still pays the price of this arrogance, to reassert itself as the only power that can militarily represent the interests of the whole imperialist world. But what was the meaning of American hegemony? Was it just that it had more nuclear bombs than the others? Or that it had a more prepared army, or that it had managed to have military bases before the others, or that it had built more airplane carriers? No. It became hegemonic in the sense that it offered a collective strategy for bourgeoisies all over the world. Think post-World War II. What Americanism meant at that point. It meant industrialization, it meant forest accumulation, mass consumerism and individualism, Hollywood, anti-communism, but also aesthetic radicalism from some point onwards. The CIA was funding, we all know that, abstract expressionist exhibitions all over the world and promoting artistic modernism, not political radicalism, of course, etc., etc. So, if we think of that period, we can see what hegemony means. It means actually trying to lead, in Gramsci's words, being dirigente, being leader in a way of the imperialist thing. And it was even ready at that point to think, for example, of even leaving room to its competitors, which is a very well-known fact that the US promoted European integration, whereas and it promoted, and even though it knew at the time that this would mean, that Germany would become an industrial competitor. It helped Japan and South Korea become competitors. It had no problem with that. Of course, there was competition, but it's interesting if you put this together. These are aspects of hegemonic policy. Of course, at the same time, it promoted American interests. This is very well known, part of history, transnational corporations, etc., 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 increased economic role. This was an aspect of hegemonic policy. Why is Germany dominating European Union and not being a hegemon? For the same reason, because it promotes austerity. It promotes austerity at the expense of the others, and for Germany, this means a constant comparative advantage, and this creates a very important aspect of the crisis of European Union, because European Union is a part of the imperialist chain. It is an imperialist project by itself, and it doesn't have a hegemonic force. This creates a constant crisis of hegemony and opens up the space for antagonism. And, for example, this can explain also the contradictions of American imperialism. Whenever it failed to do so, this also created challenges to its hegemony. This can also explain, for example, what is the real stake in the antagonism with China and Russia. There is antagonism, but is, for example, and I'm saying this as an open question, and I don't have an answer. You can see people offering both kinds of answers. For example, can China export a social, political, ideological, consumer, cultural model? Well, you can say that in certain parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, it creates conditions, for example, of some sort of this kind of hegemonic relations, but can it export it all over the world? Can it, for example, align with Russia, the Russian kind of version of globalization with sovereign states, be kind of hegemonic proposal? Perhaps. I'm not trying to open up this discussion. I'm just trying to say why, if we think in terms of hegemony, it's much more useful than all this hegemony in a Gramscian sense, not just hegemon being the most powerful force. We can see in a more dialectical way, open questions and the contradictions. The contradictions in contemporary world are not just economic contradictions, are not just economic antagonisms, are not just about whether there's going to be more free trade or whether there's going to be more access to natural resources. The root of the current antagonism in all this very complex interplay of interdependence and antagonism at the same time, because they are interdependent. By the way, they were very interdependent at 1914. Europe was economically extremely integrated at that period. This did not prevent, many millions of dead youths as a result of antagonism. But today, yes, there is interdependence, but there is also it's antagonism about how hegemony is going to be formed. And hegemony never has always to do about who's on top. Also has to do about who's the subaltern. That is, what relation is going to be between, what kind of relationship leadership is going to emerge. So yes, perhaps we are in a transition period, but this hasn't got to do with American GDP or very simple variables like that. It's much more complex. And of course we should know that Europe is not going to be hegemonic. This is also another way to see the crisis, the inherent crisis of the European project. Europe is becoming more politically, economically, culturally irrelevant in contemporary antagonisms. Even the Americans managed to keep the global economy afloat. Quantitative easing, was it just to save American banks? No, it was also a way out of the global crisis. That was a hegemonic project. What did Europe do? Being the sickest part of the global economy, drawing the global economy into deflation. This is counter-hegemonic. This is the exact opposite of hegemonic project. That's a quote about Europe. So I think that's the interesting thing about Gramsci. So this is this point I wanted to make. Okay. Now, okay, I have some things about Europe, but I can skip them. So perhaps if anyone is interested, I can speak about European integration as an imperialist project in the questions and answers part of the debate. So just to conclude, imperialism is here. And we need to theorize imperialism. We need to think imperialism in all its complexities. We need to rethink that dimension of a connection between theorizing imperialism and thinking about revolutionary strategy. That is the defining aspect of Lenin's project. But we also have to remember that fighting against imperialism means also fighting against the social relations that give rise to it. And I think that in contrast to other ages in the history of the left today, anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggles are most connected than ever. So the fight is far from over, and I hope I did not tire you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Panagiotis, for the lecture. Before I open the floor up for discussion, I would have one question. So you started your lecture with presenting contemporary Marxist theorists like Alex Kalinikos and others that argue for combining of, on the one hand, some realist insights with Marxist insights, and with this combination to produce a contemporary non-reductive Marxist theory of imperialism. You expressed some skepticism about that via Martin Gonzalo Pozo, and I agree with his reservations about Kalinikos' call. However, I would ask you this. If we are truly committed to a non-reductive Marxist theory of imperialism, and if we agree with what you said at the end, that we can't reduce politics to economics, that we cannot say that, for example, America went into Iraq because of its economic interests, because of market competition and so on. What can we say? What kind of a Marxist theory of imperialism can we develop if we repudiate this Kalinikos' call for a realist moment? And just to add something, I think that even though there are some problems with what Kalinikos proposes, he is on the right track when he says in his discussion with Justin Rosenberg that there should be a realist moment in every Marxist theory of imperialism, just like there is a liberal moment in Marxist critique of political economy, when Marx says that some liberal insights are true with regards to market and distribution. For example, what liberal theorists say about the distribution of profits, rents, and so on is completely true, and also it is true that economic actors on the market are free in the sense that they are legally free. However, of course, liberal theories are hopeless when they come into production and how surplus value is produced. So, to pose the question again, if we abandon Kalinikos' call for a Marxist theory of imperialism that has a minuscule realist moment, by which I mean that we should take into account, besides economic interests, also the strategies of political actors, and this is something that realism and neo-realism are good at discussing, and if we say that there are inevitable antagonisms between nation-states, and nation-states are something that exists in capitalism because it was inherited from feudalism and absolutism. What can we do instead of just saying, well, okay, politics is just condensed class struggle. When America went into war with Iraq, it was just class politics, capitalist class wanted to go there, and so on.
No, never. Okay. Well, first of all, the realist moment in Marxist theories of imperialism was there from the beginning, and it was, in my opinion, in the theory of imperialist chain. That is, the priority of national social formations as opposed to a conception of a global system. I think that is a common element, the persistence of the state, the importance of interstate antagonisms. So it's not, my position is not that we underestimate these aspects, but how not just we incorporate it as an extra level added to political economy, as just adding political economy or economic explanation of geopolitical antagonism, but try to integrate them into a theory of hegemony. And I use the verb integrate in a certain way, thinking of Gramsci's conception of the integral state, stato integrale, which is the combination of all forms of hegemony, all aspects of hegemony. And I think this is what we must try to think about the international system. States antagonize themselves. They antagonize themselves because they are condensed. They represent strategic interests, and this is important. They represent the condensation of class struggle, and this can explain them. For example, how this defines varieties of nationalism. States antagonize for ideological, for political, for economic reasons in all their dialectic. So what is needed is a very, both theoretically and analytically, to think of all these aspects, and this is of course the open aspect of a contemporary theory of imperialism. We are far from over. For example, for example, American military interventionism in the 2000s. This is a very complex history. It has, for example, internal social definitions, an attempt to reassert a certain kind of American patriotism on the inside, the use of the imagery of a nation under threat as a way to create an imaginary bond in a society torn apart by neoliberalism, or in many neoconservative thinkers it was also necessary to counter the disintegrating effects of multiculturalism or cosmopolitan pluralism, etc., etc., etc. At the same time, there were pressures about, for example, very material interests, safeguarding energy resources, which for the Americans has always been a very particular strategic point. And it was also where they always managed to maintain leadership over the rest of the world by saying that we can do it. It was also a need to make sure that only the Americans can lead a successful war, which has been a very important aspect since the fall of the socialist states. That is, to make sure that any form of collective security is American-led. There's no multilateral, more multipolar conception of strategy. So, of course, they knew this had cost. In macroeconomic terms, it had cost. Of course, there were also very specific interested in an economic effort. Perhaps some people were thinking also how to combine this with a repetition of Reagan's military Keynesianism of the early 1980s. I've forgotten our story, but Star Wars was not just about, it was also about using state coffers as a way to reignite the American high-tech industry, etc., etc. So you can, I'm just remembering aspects of 2000. Of course, there was also a very idealist, but also hegemonic in this sense, conception that they could actually, you know, military export democracy and, Western-type civil society institutions into a country. The whole arrogance about failed states and remaking them, etc., etc., etc. So yes, it is much more complex than geopolitics, much more complex than political, that simply articulation. And in the end, it had about hegemony, about who's going to be hegemonic in the contradictions of the post-Cold War world. So this is my answer. So in this sense, I'm not saying that Alex Kallinikos was wrong, and as I said, his books about imperialism are very interesting, and the positions he had taken, especially regarding the Iraq War, etc. I mean, they were politically sound. I'm saying that if we just say that what is needed is political economy plus geopolitics, we do not problematize the question enough, because we're not discussing what to write on a political tract. We're not discussing what to say at a demonstration. We're not, I mean, a combination of Marxist political economy and realist geopolitics is really good. It can say people truth in a mass demonstration and inspire them to go and have a very, very big protest outside the American embassy, which is a very healthy thing to do every 3 or 4 months. And if you can go by the German embassy, that's even healthier for me. That's it. But this is, we're talking about theory. And Marxists must never fear open questions. They must search for open questions. They must constantly question themselves and problematize. I'm not saying that we have today a Marxist theory of imperialism, and I'm not saying that even Lenin had a Marxist theory of imperialism, or Bukharin, even at his best in the 1920s. I'm saying that they offered a new theoretical vista of new questions, open questions, and I think this is what we need now. And I think that, especially if we try to combine a theory of uneven development with a theory of hegemony, but in the full sense of hegemony, that means going a little bit beyond what until today has been the Gramscian versions of international relations, however important they are. I think this offers a way to answer your question, which in this sense still remains an open one.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now we have, I think, 20 minutes for discussion. Any questions or comments? Okay, 13 minutes are welcome.
In order a country to be a successful hegemon in the way you described it, do you think that its government needs a good theory of imperialism, or at least unconsciously a good understanding of imperialism? So does American government have that? Do they have a good theory of imperialism?
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think that when Americans stopped having very sound theories of imperialism, for example, in neoconservative follies about being able to wage 2 or 3 wars at the same time, then they had a problem. But that's the one positive thing that systemic forces, or bourgeois forces, if you prefer, have. They don't necessarily need a theory. Marxists need a theory. Revolutionary movements need a theory because they want to actually analyze the world. What they need is if they can actually be in a position to read, even within the ideological lenses of bourgeois ideology, what is happening in the world. Well, I think that in terms of bourgeois theory, contemporary bourgeois theory of international relations, I think that it is interesting that there is theoretical unease at this point. I'm not an international relations theory specialist, by the way, but as far as I know, they are also theoretically a bit in crisis. They also search for a narrative. Realism, for example, was the grand narrative of the Cold War. Realism in the international plane plus Keynesianism at home was a rather good combination. It worked. And because realism also included, you know, if you are realism, when you use it in blocks, so America had to be the leader of a bloc, can also incorporate elements of a hegemonic policy. Can say, okay, you create relations of friendship, you help your allies, etc., etc. It's not just antagonism without limits. But today I think that in the same way as in the objective situation, the world is searching for a new, is in the process of finding a new balance. In the same way, in international relations theory, you still have very, very open questions. It's not easy to find grand narratives, because the last kind of grand narratives we had from systemic forces, which were the last versions of neo-realist theories of American empire, which tried to justify aspects of American policy in the 2000s. Some of them critical of imperialism, for example, still are far from explaining contemporary contradictions. And also some of them were responsible for failures of the Americans. They're aggressive. Remember that they did not, we were 12 years after 2003, 14 years after 2001, and they're going back to, you know, they failed in Iraq, they still have a war to wage in Afghanistan and try to share the burden with their allies, and they're going back to pre-neocon conceptions of, well, let's talk with Iranians and find a way to find an understanding. And at the same time, they are still far from discussing what to do with China, find a narrative how to deal with this antagonism. In this sense, I don't know, and in this sense, perhaps we are also in a transition period regarding American foreign policy. I think that the rebalance that the Obama years attempted to bring, that is sort of holding the reins a little bit on the neocon extremism of the Bush era and combining a little bit with the Clintonite attempt to justify imperialism through other ideological resources. I think it also comes to an end. And because I think that in the same way that within the American society, it's an open question, even within the American bourgeoisie, which way to take. Go back to aggressive neoliberalism, which would mean, for example, an isolationist, expansionary kind of neocon aggressive policy in the international plane, or keep up in the same contemporary attempt to correct some of these aspects. So yes, they have an open debate themselves, one might say, and it's interesting to follow these debates, and perhaps one of the mistakes that most Marxists do, we don't follow enough the debates of the enemy.
Okay, we have
of course, with the exception of Europe, where when the interesting stuff is that European elites are unable even to hold a rational debate.
We have some time for other questions.
At what time would you place the shift in America's global role? Because I think if you look at Iraq, this Iraq, not the previous one, I think we're already too late. I see perhaps the late 70s, early 80s at this great shift. First of all, through the Volcker shock, which sent shockwaves across the world, a new, basically they were ready to push developing countries into a crisis to handle internal class struggles. Since class struggle has been intensifying throughout the 70s in the United States, then the transformation of the IMF, the World Bank, into really violent mechanisms like we see them today. Also in the 80s, first open conflicts of the United States with the United Nations. For example, in 84 and 85, the UK and the US left UNESCO out of protest. So clearly were not able to impose their program and turned into more and more violent means. And I think we have to look at this dynamic, how the state is able to handle the internal dynamics of class struggle and reconcile them with its global hegemonic role. And I think the same is happening with Germany. I think they know very well that if they want to solve these trade imbalances in Europe, they have the option either to push Greece and the periphery into the third world, or allow German workers to earn more and give up a bit of their competitiveness. And of course, German capital is not prepared. They've spent more than 10 years pushing workers' wages and rights down. Of course, they're not going to allow for a solution that negates this achievement.
Well, yes, you're right. I think that the late 1970s are very crucial for the redefinition of American policies, some of the aspects of which we still see today. I think that you are right by pointing how it's not just how they try to put an end to Keynesianism and try to introduce, monetarist policies. It's also that they try to reassert the centrality of the dollar and the centrality of Wall Street in a new global financial architecture. This was a very important aspect of American policy in the past 35, 36 years. And in this sense, you're right. And I think that in this aspect, Leo Panich and Sam Gillis, their book is right. And also Peter Gowan had written about this evolution, the importance of making sure that in the global capital flows, there is still the Wall Street remains essential. And all the evolution of the American banking system, all its international role, which is a very complex and political role. Goldman Sachs, for example, is not just an investment bank or the world's biggest investment bank. It is at the same time a political consultant, a political strategist. It is a very an ideological apparatus of the state, etc., etc. So yes, you're right, and of course, one can see the dynamics in the 1980s. The Americans made sure that no other form of collective security would be in place, both by escalating the antagonism with the Soviet Union with a view to bring it to its knees, which in the end happened, perhaps faster than what the Americans had thought initially, because since they're not Marxists, they could not understand internal class dynamics, which was what defined the evolution of the Soviet Union, and also to make sure, for example, that the Gorbachev-Kohl-Mitterrand plans were never successful, and the OSCE remained a secondary international organization instead of the main collective organization of security in the Europe, etc., etc. It's also interesting how they handled the first Iraq crisis. Because it's interesting, the first Iraq crisis. we all know that initially, and that was also the rationale for Saddam Hussein to attack Kuwait, because Saddam Hussein always had ties to the Americans and thought that in the old days this would have been accepted, condemned, but accepted. But the US decided to organize a giant crusade against Iraq and to liberate Kuwait. It was not just about the oil, by the way. Okay, Saddam Hussein would have controlled more oil, but Saddam Hussein mainly at that period wanted to sell as much oil as possible and so be part of the game. But the Americans wanted to make a show of force, but it's not possible to have sub-imperialisms of this kind, and in this sense the 1991 war on Iraq is emblematic, in the same way that it was in the Clinton period that the current form of military interventionism was constituted, and the 1999, not just the 1999 attack on Serbia, but also I think the whole sequence from NATO taking over military intervention from 95 until 99 in the Yugoslav tragedy. That was also the testing ground for this very aggressive intervention. So yes, there is it's not just the Iraq War of 2003. I think that ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, it is a constant aspect of American foreign policy to make sure that no other country has the military, economic and political capacity to guarantee the collective capitalist interest, the collective geopolitical interest in the same, as the US. So this is a constant element, even if this means managed instability, if this means augmenting crisis in order to retain the possibility of interventions, etc., etc. But it's interesting that even in this aggressive and in very aspects selfish in a way, attitude of the Americans, still there is a hegemonic element. They are saying that they are the only potential leaders of the capitalist world, that they can lead the capitalist world into geopolitical stability, prosperity, etc., and of course at the same time guarantee American interests. So this is the open question for China, for example. Can it offer the same guarantees? Can it offer the same hegemonic aspects or not? Or it just wants to strike a balance with the US sort of things. And if, on the other hand, the US cannot handle this kind of balance, will it resort to more geopolitical aggression? In this sense, for example, Ukraine is also a very important testing ground, and I'm not, living for the moment outside all the other aspects of the Ukraine crisis, internal and also it is also a form of aggression in the sense of trying to put pressure upon Russia in a way very, very much reminiscent of this kind of war by proxy in the in the Cold War period. It's a very classical form of putting pressure. So yes, the Americans are still in this kind of thing. I'm just saying that in some, and this is a constant element, and there's an element of continuity in American diplomacy and American military. And I was just saying that the Obama period tried somehow to correct some aspects in the sense of controlling certain more arrogance and self-destructive aspects, destructive for American capital aspects of neocon foreign policy. But you're right about 79 and the economic aspects. We tend to forget them sometimes.
Yeah, okay. I will try to keep it short. You touched the issue that I wanted to bring up just at the end of your answer, the Ukrainian crisis. We've been discussing here in our party the issue of Ukrainian crisis in terms of imperialism, and that is why your lecture today was very interesting to us. Well, empirically we say, okay, there is a certain form of civil war going on in Ukraine, with, of course, interference of outer forces. On the one hand, the Westerns, and on the other hand, the Russian Federation. There is one part of us who are saying, okay, we are dealing with two imperialisms, pretty much imperialisms of symmetrical situation. So the political implication of this is, of course, that we must condemn both in the same way. I, on the other side, and some of the other comrades, are saying this is a pretty theoretical way of looking at this issue, at these developments, because although we can say that Russia has certain elements of empires which are transhistorical, it is sort of a multinational state. It has certain authoritarian features of authority, etc., etc., and it makes certain military moves. Still, this is not imperialism in Marxist or Leninist terms. Whereas the other side, I think, is acting in imperialist way, in a neo-imperialist way, such as you have been describing. It's making these trade agreements or association agreements with Ukraine, which are basically investment agreements, making structural changes in Ukraine, making ways for not only investment but also creating relations of production which are of capitalist type, in modern capitalist type in Ukraine, where they are not established as such. Whereas there are no economic reason in Russian reactions. Annexation of Crimea is not economically rational. This is it has to be supported. It is not an asset in economic terms. Donetsk and Lugansk also. If anything, it is a competition to Russian heavy industry and mining industry, etc., etc. So, and the implication of this is, of course, the protagonist of this situation is the Western imperialism, because it is the imperialist in this pure sense of the world. It is the force that is dictating the tempo, whereas the reaction of the East Ukrainian rebels or separatists, if you like to call it that way, and the Russian Federation is basically, let's say, pre-modern, or is certainly a pre-modern reaction to this advanced type of imperialism. And that's why, in the last instance, when we as politicians must decide which side to, well, not support, because we are not in place to support anyone, but still in moral terms, which side should be condemned, I would say that this should be the Western side. Even if no one is putting a gun against my head, I would say that if we have to choose sides, then we should choose the Russian and anti-Kiev side in these terms. So I'd like to hear your interpretation of what is going on.
Yes, basically, I think I agree with your take, if I understood it well. Well, I think that when I mentioned the Ukraine, I mentioned it as an example of how inter-imperialist rivalry persists today, and you can see it as a form of American interventionism, even if this means managed instability and not, stability as we use it, which by itself is very dangerous. By itself, this kind of Western intervention, creating at the heart of Europe a civil war, or giving it more reasons to take more aggressive forms is negative. The same goes for all the question of measures against Russia, etc., etc. This is a negative development by itself. Now, I think the question is not whether it is inter-imperialist rivalry or who is imperialist or not in this question, because even if we accept that the antagonism between the US and Russian Federation in this particular conjuncture is an antagonism between imperialist powers, or at least the dominant imperialist power, and a force that attempts to find an improved position in the world. This does not mean that our answer should always be neither nor. Neither nor answers are usually wrong answers. I use an example. For example, many comrades in the 1970s or 1980s, both from Trotskyists or in Greece from Maoists, milieus would say varieties of the neither Washington nor Moscow position, this kind of slogan. It was wrong. Let's think, 1970s, okay. If you say that neither nor, it means that you don't care who's going to win. No, we did care who was going to win, and when Washington won in this antagonism, it was bad. Well, I never supported the Soviet Union. I never thought that this is our ideal of socialism. I never thought that it was socialist, and this can be the subject of another lecture, but I didn't want them to collapse. It was bad for the working classes all over the world. What happened in geopolitical, in economic, in social, ideological, symbolic, etc. And yes, the same goes for many, many things that followed after that collapse. So yes, you cannot have a neither nor. Its contradiction is particular. One aspect of its crisis can have different outcomes. Not all outcomes are symmetrical. So I choose this reading instead of, because it helps, and then you can see, of course, if we start by this reading, we do not identify ourselves with Russia in any way, even if we can understand what they are doing, what their actions, etc., etc. We can, but basically we understand the stake of the conflict. The stake, what is at stake in Ukraine is not whether the left wing of Euromaidan, whether if it ever was, will find a new space. It is about imperialism antagonism and using Europe as a theater of imperialist antagonism. And we all know that using Europe, when Europe becomes the theater of imperialist antagonism, this is not good. This is not good in the long run for the people. And of course now, with all after all whatever has evolved, and of course, and then you had all the problems with the fascist elements in the Kiev sides, and you also have some, not saying all of them, progressive elements on the separate state, but leaving aside sympathies, and that's what I'm saying. I'm saying even if I leave aside my personal, for example, sympathy for the separatists and whatever is happening in the Donetsk Republic and I have comrades who have visited and they have brought back, but let's leave them aside. Let's say that they are all Russian stooges. Okay, we have American stooges versus Russian stooges in this particular. Let's simplify. Not all outcomes are good, and the wrong thing, the thing we must fight against is this kind of American intervention, and of course the fact that the European Union, despite the impressive course it still followed through with this kind of Euro-Atlanticist attachment, which can only mean trouble in the long run, because I mentioned it earlier. We know very well that the only period of lasting peace in the imperialist chain, when was a large part of the world was not part of the imperialist chain. So I'm not sure this use the Kautsky phrase, supra-imperialist phase, for how much longer it will last. And I think at least one thing that both realist theories and Marxist imperialist theories agree is that prolonged antagonism and competition in the imperialist chain, in the international plane, in the end leads to war. And this is something to worry about in the contemporary. And in this sense, Ukraine might be a very, very, very important warning sign that we must not look over.
But you didn't take sides.
No, I tried for argument's sake to avoid taking side in the internal conflict. I said that personally I sympathize with the Donetsk Republic, and I have no sympathy for the Kiev regime, because it's exactly this kind of post-communist, servile to the Americans, ready to incorporate the fascist kind of regime, which I think represents whatever is worst about contemporary world, whether it is in the Ukraine or in the Baltic republics, or I don't know, or in the current Polish government, this kind of mixture of neoliberalism, Americanism, and Atlanticism and authoritarianism I dislike. And in this sense, the separatist claims seem to me more positive. But what I try to say is that, although I don't have much sympathy for Putin or Russia, but I'm saying that in this antagonism, you have to understand what is at stake and what is the determining aspect, the primary aspect of the contradiction, as Mao would have said. And I think the primary aspect is American aggression or tentative aggression in a view of an escalation of the antagonism with China and Russia. Which, by the way, this might be an interesting aspect of the future. That is, in order to avoid a direct confrontation with China, escalating the confrontation with Russia, etc., etc. But that's what I try to say, apart from my own personal sympathies, because I think that if you don't sympathize with, if you don't take sides, you can still see the stake of the contradiction.
Okay, we are almost 20 minutes over time, so we'll take one last question from Leo, and then we really have to conclude, so 5 minutes and then we're out.
Thank you. For a non-territorial theory of imperialism, we entered very deeply in geopolitics. So I'd like to go back to theory. With Lenin, metaphor of the weakest link is still very territorial, of course. He insists on that, I would say more even than Rosa on collapse of capitalism. So my question is, of course, contemporary. What would be your point? Is anti-imperialist struggle today non-territorial, or is Europe the weakest link?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I meant it's not territorial, and I insist that the theory of the weakest link of the chain is non-territorial, along with the whole of Lenin's theory of imperialism, in the sense that it's not about the conquer of territory or of natural resources. Of course, the imperialist chain is an image of the world, and it is an image of the world as marked by antagonisms, by hierarchies, and of course an image of the world of nation states. It includes the centrality of the nation state or the social formation, or the national social formation, as the main locus, the main place of class struggle, and also of the extended reproduction of capitalism. And in this sense, I think that it is still useful. I don't think that, and this is my disagreement with theories of transnational capitalism, such as William Robinson's, that the world is still a world of states. And we are far from overcoming this kind of there's nothing teleological in that. I mean, for example, we all know that before the nation states, other forms were tested, such as, for example, the Hanseatic League or the Italian city-state, but they could not offer that kind of hegemonic potential in order to create a historic in a society and thus be able both to reproduce capitalism and have a place in the world that the nation state offered, along with the ability to deal with the reproduction of class antagonism. So I think in this sense the imagery of the imperialist chain is interesting. Now, regarding the weakest link of the chain, I think that what is important in the theory of the weakest link, as Lenin describes it in his post-revolutionary texts, and as Althusser tried to review in his 1960s text, is that it says that weakness is not a magnitude, it's not a quantitative aspect. You are not weak as opposed to strong. You cannot find grades of strength. Weakness has to do with how contradictory you are. What is the extent of the antagonisms that traverse a social formation? Russia was not weak. It was a big imperial power. It was on the right side of the war, or the winning side of the war. It had managed to transform itself into an industrial society. It was not weak. It would be unfair. And perhaps it was on the way of kind of parliamentary absolutism, following perhaps the German path in a similar way. But at the same time, it had all the contradictions, which war only accentuated it and exacerbated. That is, internal contradictions, class contradictions, ideological contradictions, coherence contradictions, unity contradictions as an empire, etc., etc. So that created its weakness, and that is why it was the point to strike, because Lenin did think in terms of world revolution. He did not think, but he said that you must strike at the weakest link if you want to overturn. So I think this is still relevant. Is Europe going to be the weakest link of the imperialist chain? That's an interesting. That's something interesting to think of. Well, there are many contradictions. Huh? Sorry?
Especially if one lives in Europe.
Huh?
If one is living in Europe, it is especially.
Yes, of course, we always think of our place, but I think that there are certain aspects that you can find weak links in Europe. I think that the European integration project is in crisis. It is an economic crisis. The architecture of the euro has proven all its problems and all its contradictions. There's no actual leadership, although there is domination, let's say, within the European Union. There's no exit strategy. There is ideological crisis of the systemic parties. Conservative, liberal, and social liberal parties are all alike. Unfortunately, many segments of the European left are also somehow in a certain aphasic state, but this can be corrected, I hope, in the process. For example, an element of crisis is that, for example, in France you have an impressive political crisis of all systemic parties, and the emergence of the most clever far-right Western Europe has seen in the past decades, and they don't know what to do about it, which of course is also a tragedy for the left. So, but you had Greece. You had Greece in the most impressive sequence of economic crisis, social movement, political crisis, and political change. Leaving aside the Greek questions and whatever I can say about Syriza, it is an impressive, it's an historical, it's a groundbreaking change that has happened in Greece. So, yes, I think that, but what is missing in Europe as that nec plus ultra is to have this kind of movement process as you are in Greece. I think this is exactly this kind of excessive element that actually changes the balance of forces. You have it in Greece, you have it in Spain, that's also interesting what is happening there. You did not have it in the same extent in Ireland, although political developments are interesting there, and unless you have it in Italy, France, or Germany at the center, then I'm not sure that it will become, because in the end this will, because it can be, to be the weakest link means exactly to have intense contradictions, intense antagonisms, otherwise we just stagnate. Then Europe then might just become less important. That's the danger. But I think that that's the challenge for the left. Europe can send a message of hope to broader areas of the world, but this opens up a very, very different debate. And I hope, let's say, that if Greece, if the Greek movement, if not only the suffering, but also the struggles that we have been through in the past years, if all these very violent changes in our lives contribute to recreating conditions for a weak link and opening changes of broader transformation, then it sure was worth the trouble.